Okay, one more type of inhibition to think about, right? So you can think about competitive and non-competitive inhibition as sort of the limiting cases of a more general concept of enzyme inhibition. I think competitive inhibitors are actually quite common, right? It's fairly easy to develop them. It's easy for evolution to find them. It's easy for human beings to design them because you just need a molecule that matches the features of the substrate um, or the transition state. And you can come up with really good competitive inhibitors. So there are lots and lots of good examples of clean competitive inhibitors. True non-competitive inhibitors are somewhat less common. They do occur, but to actually find a small molecule that binds to a second site on the enzyme and impacts catalysis without having any impact on the thermodynamic parameters of substrate binding is a little bit more of a challenge. So true non-competitive inhibition is somewhat more rare. What's far more common for inhibiting small molecules that bind to second sites on enzymes is for that small molecule to impact both um, Km and Vmax, or I should say both Km and Kcat, ultimately Vmax, um, by second site binding, right? So it's not at all uncommon to find small molecules that interact with a site near the active site, doesn't really overlap with it, so it doesn't directly compete, but it does something to the structure of the dynamics of the enzyme that both messes with the ability of the active site to position residues that are necessary for catalysis, therefore dropping Kcat, but by messing with the active site also makes it harder for the substrate to bind effectively, right? This is type of inhibition where both Km and Kcat are affected is known as mixed inhibition. And this is actually really common to find inhibitors that mess with both the ability of the enzyme to bind the substrate and also to do chemistry once the substrate is even bound, right? So you're going to hear about mixed inhibition, or you'll see mixed inhibition if you work with enzymes and inhibitors. You'll see this a lot, where you don't get necessarily a clean impact on just the Kcat or the Km, especially if it's not designed to bind right in the active site, to bind somewhere else, right? Okay, having said that, there is one sort of special case of mixed inhibition where this effect of messing with Kcat and Km happens in a particular way. And in particular, there's a class of inhibitors that alter or modify Km and Kcat in proportional amounts, right? So the extent to which Kcat and Km are modified is sort of proportional, right? Or you can think about the ratio of Kcat to Km stays the same for the enzyme, right? So the simplest way in which that happens, and you notice I'm not going to try and derive any of the steady state expressions, give the initial rate expressions for mixed inhibition, because there are lots of ways in which this can happen. The expressions can be a little more complex, and so I'm just going to leave it as sort of that qualitative description of how mixed inhibition would result in changes to both Kcat and Km. But for one special class of mixed inhibition, it's probably worth knowing a little bit about what the scheme would look like. Again, I'm not going to derive the steady state expression because this type of inhibition is exceedingly rare. Again, does happen, but is not really common. And this is where one has a small molecule that doesn't bind to the free enzyme, right? Again, here's our Km. Here's our Michaelis complex. Here's our enzyme going on to make product with Kcat. But there are situations where there's a small molecule that doesn't bind to the free enzyme at all. In fact, it recognizes particular features of the Michaelis complex itself and only binds to the Michaelis complex to form a dead end right, or a non-reactive um, uh, ternary complex with an associated Ki. This special example of mixed inhibition is often called, or it was classically known as, uncompetitive. Don't get that confused with non-competitive, uncompetitive inhibition. And the reason you bring it up is because it, like I said, it does occur. Again, it's much more difficult to design an inhibitor that does this, but they do exist. Uncompetitive inhibition has a particularly distinctive signature when you look at the double reciprocal plots of uncompetitive inhibitors. What they do is shift these plots in, like I said, a very distinctive way. Here again is our 1 over V naught, 1 over the concentration of substrate here. So in the absence of our inhibitor, we would have, of course, our nice straight line, right, that looked like this. Let me do it right. Oh, shoot. So having trouble now. Okay, right. With an uncompetitive inhibitor, what's going to happen is you get a family of parallel curves, right? Okay, so what I was drawing out before the my screen share decided to stop working is the fact that in the presence of a truly uncompetitive inhibitor that, again, only recognizes or specifically recognizes the Michaelis complex, is you get this family of curves in a double reciprocal plot that are parallel lines, right? And the reason they're parallel is because, like I said before, what's essentially happening with an uncompetitive inhibitor is that the ratio of Km to Vmax pretty much stays the same, right? So the inhibitor, because of this specific targeting of the Michaelis complex itself to form this ternary complex, has this particular impact of changing Km and Vmax both, but in a constant way, right? And that leads to this family of parallel lines. Now, again, it's worth knowing about uncompetitive inhibition, mainly because it exists, and you may hear about it, but you don't really come across it all that much, right? It's, like I said, far more common to find inhibitors that are either competitive or that are mixed when you really get into working on enzyme inhibitors. Okay.